Well, summer is the perfect time for comics. What kid didn't spend all their extra money on Spider-Man and Archie comics growing up? But comics and graphic novels have come a long way since then, and they are now for everyone, and our guests today are here for it. On Blue Sky today, we're having a celebration of Saskatchewan's comic scene. We'll be joined by comic artists and lovers from across the province, and we want to hear from you too. What's your favorite comic or graphic novel? Bonus points if it's made in Saskatchewan. So you can join the conversation today by calling 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Now, I have some comic queens in our Saskatoon studio today. Jody Kaysen works at Amazing Stories, a comic book store in Saskatoon. She also hosts the Punch radio and TV show. If you live in Saskatoon, you may have heard it on Friday evenings on Saskatoon Community Radio. Her show spotlights pop culture in the province. And today, Jody is doing just that with us. So hello, Jody. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Thank you. It's so fun to be here. It's my favorite topic.
I love it. And your t-shirt, you're wearing an Amazing Stories t-shirt.
I sure am.
Of course you are.
Tumbled out of work, was just working for some comics and came down here to share the love.
I love it. We also have in our Saskatoon studio Elaine Will. Elaine has been drawing comics since she was 5 and uses it as a form of self-expression. Elaine, welcome to Blue Sky.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's so good to have you here. And then in our Regina studio, we have Dakota McFadden. Dakota is a graphic artist and comic who has 3 books published through Conundrum Press. His work has also appeared in Mad Magazine and The New Yorker, and he's also drawn storyboards for DreamWorks and Netflix. He's currently balancing his comic career and being a dad of 2 young boys who are now also obsessed with comics, of course. Dakota, welcome to Blue Sky.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So good to have you. Jody, I want to start with you because you're closest to me.
Sure.
We'll start with you. How would you describe the comic community in Saskatchewan right now?
It is absolutely vibrant. I mean, we have some heavy hitters, some famous people like Tom Grummett and Riley Rossmo, but like a growing stable of amazing creators. Like a dozen people at least are consistently putting out product, and it's all good and it's all diverse, like stuff for kids, stuff for adults, historical, you name it. There's like something for everybody, and it's so cooperative. I know other communities, make comics. Sure, they do, but I think ours is really special because there's this desire to help everybody out. So if you're doing a Kickstarter, this guy will help you with this, or they'll give you advice, or, they know somebody who's a colorist, or somebody wants to do the text or whatever. Like everybody works together really, really well. And when we do little cons and stuff like that, like everybody knows each other. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a little party more than just like sitting at a table and waiting through the day. It's like, it's a lot more fun. It's very, very vibrant. And I'm really proud to be part of it.
And for those that are really quite successful, you mentioned Tom Grummett, right? Riley Rossmo. What are they doing that really puts them on the map?
Well, both of them have been doing it for a really long time. Like Tom is literally decades worth. He's in the top 20 of the most prolific graphic designer comic creators in the world. Like if you count how many pages he's done independently for DC, for Marvel, for like many different publishers, he has like more pages than just about anybody. So he's been at the game a long time.
And he's ours.
And he's ours. And he's lovely. And what I especially love about Tom's stuff is that he's so diligent. Like he's not lazy. Like every panel is just jam-packed full of stuff. It's not just the characters in the foreground. You got like buildings and stuff happening in the background. And, it's easy to get lazy because it's really hard work to put out a graphic novel or a comic. Like it's many, many, many hours of blood, sweat, and tears. So to put in all those extra things like as a comic reader, it's like I really appreciate that.
You appreciate that kind of detail.
Yeah.
What do you look for in a comic book, kind of in general? I was just sharing with you that my gateway into this was Ducks at One Canada Reads, which maybe says it all about me, who I am, and the kind of books that I read. That was my foray into it.
It's a good one.
Yeah, but what do you look for, or what tells you that this is a good comic book?
Well, you get comic books that are great stories and okay art. And then you get great art and maybe mediocre stories. When you get the combo of both, it's magic.
So what are some magical ones?
Oh, well, part 2 of my favorite thing is Monsters just came out. Emile Ferris, she's an amazing artist. Her books are just like they're 400 plus pages and they're all done in colored ballpoint pens. So it's like nothing you've ever seen before. And she recreates like classical art pieces. And it also tells the story of this amazing little girl who sort of sees herself as a werewolf and wants to like solve mysteries that are happening in her apartment building. And it's just, there's so much to it. I read the first issue and read it again and again and again. And number 2 just came out in the last month. And it's one of my favorites for sure. It's just heartwarming and amazing.
And I want to ask each of you this question. What was the comic book that first got you hooked?
Well, that's the double-faceted. The first book that I can really remember buying was Shogun Warriors, so that's like a long time ago.
Yeah.
But the book that changed my life for comics was 8 Ball by Daniel Klaus. He's an amazing alternative creator, came out in like the late 80s, early 90s, and it showed me that, this isn't capes and stuff. This is like a comic book can be about anything, and it's brilliant.
Yeah, I was just telling you too that there's a graphic novel that I've been wanting to read about the refugee crisis, which I like. That's an incredibly interesting way to tell a story, a very difficult story.
Yeah, there's Joe Sacco is a well-known comic maker, and he tackles like Palestine and like all different war zones around the world. So he's got like a dozen plus books of crises of refugees and war, and it really is a great way to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. You've convinced me. Elaine, you've been kind of nodding along, and so let's start with the first comic book that got you hooked.
So again, this is a multifaceted question for me as well. So the comic that I read as a kid that made me want to draw comics was Archie's Sonic the Hedgehog #0, drawn by Scott Shaw. And I actually own an original page from that issue now.
Wow.
Because it was the comic. And I was 7 years old and I read it and I was like, yeah, I want to do this. And so then when I was a teenager, I read a book called The Tale of One Bad Rat by Brian Talbot, which was also extremely formative for me. And like Jody was saying, it's about a young girl who runs away from home. She lives in London, and she runs away from home to the English Lake District. And it turns out she's done that because she's fleeing sexual abuse at the hands of her father.
Oh my God.
And so, yeah, it's a really like harrowing story, but also like it's really sorry. I'm kind of stumbling over my words.
I can imagine a difficult read, but clearly has stayed with you all this time.
Yeah, for sure. And so that was the book for me that was like, oh, I didn't realize you could use comics to tell a really serious story like this.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That speaks to the power of it. Dakota, what about you? What was your first comic book that got you hooked?
I remember flipping through Casper the Friendly Ghost and Archie comics when I was a kid, and that love stuck around for quite a while. I was also raised on a lot of Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts, and now I'm reading those with my kids, which is sort of fun to see it from the other perspective simultaneously. Yeah,
I did share that your 2 young boys are now obsessed with comics too, so that's because of you, I'm sure. But tell me about their love for comic books and sort of what that has meant to you.
I mean, it's nice to see. It's something that I was conscious of not trying to push on them too hard. Obviously, I love comics a lot and have dedicated a significant portion of my life to the medium. But, just because that's true doesn't mean my kids have to like it. But thankfully, they do. So we get along a lot better because of it. They're reading a lot of Dogman right now, which is great. My older boy is just about to start 3rd grade, and he's reading fine, but like when he reads comics, he's excited about it. And, he loves prose as well. But I think there's something about comics that is a little more accessible because you're reading the pictures as well as the words, and sort of it helps early readers to figure out what's going on the page without just pure text.
Yeah. I was just saying that I'm getting into this because my kids are at that stage where they're starting to read, and just the number of choices there are out there. Like all the Babysitter Club books, a lot of them are come in a graphic novel version, or the Owl Diaries is something that my daughter's been reading. Dakota, are you finding that there's just so much more choice even from when you were a kid?
Oh, completely. There's too much to keep up with. I used to keep up with everything that was coming out, and, through a combination of getting older and having kids, I'm completely out of touch with much of reality right now. So
I know, right? So true. It happens. It does happen. Jody, what kind of events are taking place in Saskatchewan that bring people together for this love of comic books?
Well, there are tons. We have a big pop culture expo that happens at Prairie Land every year, but it's become less comic related and more like entertainment motivated. So everyone in the community has just stepped up and said, okay, well, we'll do our own thing then. So like Amazing Stories has a big show coming up on September 15th, pardon me, and it's going to be comic based with a big artist alley and, a few vendors that do comics and collectibles, but back issues and stuff. So if you're a crate digger and you want to get through them, there's lots to go from there. But every month we have a Punch Creative Club that happens at the store Wednesdays from 6:30 to 8, and it's just like people get together and we collaborate. Sometimes we'll do little fun like games and exercises to like stretch our muscles for not only drawing but like writing and creating narratives. We're working on some zines right now, which is really, really fun. And yeah, there's always like these little shows that just like pop up. We just had like a big swap meet in the garage or in the parking lot at the store just this past weekend, where nerds brought all their stuff that wasn't as important to them anymore to trade with other people and to sell and to just have a good time and kind of see what's out there in the community. So there's always stuff.
You're really the community builder in this, right? Do you do any creating yourself?
I do. I'd like to do way more, but putting everything, doing a monthly TV show and a weekly radio show, and then working all the time and all that other stuff. Like, who's got time for it all? But I got a few projects on the back burner, and I try to do as much as I can, even little bits in like the zine and some of our marketing and stuff in the store. I try to do. But lately, I've been more of a Mr. Miyagi with like being a mentor and trying to like just get people together to make stuff. So if I don't have time, at least I can get other people to get
That's
on
important
board.
too. That's important
super important.
Elaine, tell me about your creative process and what you started drawing and how that's evolved. Like, just tell us a little bit about your art.
So I started off copying the Sonic comics for many years, which taught me a lot of rudimentary cartooning skills. So I would copy them like panel for panel, and I would insert my own analog characters. So I had a character called Arcade the Lizard, who was basically Sonic but a lizard. So I did that for years. Eventually I started trying to do my own original things. So I self-published a comic in high school called New Edge, which was about this group of characters in a rock band, and they were trapped in this city, and it doesn't really go anywhere. And so I only did one issue of this because I couldn't really figure out where it was going. And now, so the comic that I'm working on right now is basically a retold version of this.
Oh, I love that.
So it's like the semi-post-apocalyptic city that's ruled by demons, and the band wants to escape so that they can go on tour in whatever might be left of the world. They know that there's a world out there somewhere, but the demons are like, no. If you leave, there's just like endless miles of desert wasteland outside the city, and you will die. So you have to stay here where it's safe.
Oh my goodness. So do you visualize the story first? Because I'm thinking about the craft, right? Like, writers, you're just writing words on paper, but you're doing both, right? You're creating a visual element, but you're also putting words to a page and telling a story. So what comes first, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, so I write in outline, and then I write a script which details like what's going to happen on each page, what's going to happen in each panel, and then from that I make thumbnails, which are like a teeny tiny sketchy version of the page, which again shows what each panel is going to look like, a very rough version. Mm-hmm. And that's the hardest part of the process for me. Even though they're like quick sketches, it's really like, engaging all my creative muscles, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then from the thumbnails, I do the finished artwork, and I'm doing it all digitally now. So I just take the thumbnails and I blow them up and I draw directly over them in the computer.
Oh, very cool. Do you feel the support of community the way kind of Jody described? Have you tapped into that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And yeah, like every time I go to a convention, it's kind of like, meeting all my family, having a great big family reunion. It's like, because sometimes because I'm kind of a hermit and I spend most of my time inside drawing. That's the only time I see some of those people is at conventions. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's really good. Dakota, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your creative process. I did a little brief read through of your resume there. When I say things like Mad Magazine and the New Yorker, it's kind of a big deal. So tell us about your creative work.
Well, I mean, it's not dissimilar to Elaine's. I like to write up rough outlines. I usually hurry through the thumbnailing process as quickly as possible and try to keep it primarily just stick figures. I'm eager to get to the page, and if I'm doing a comic for someone else, I usually do it digitally. But when I'm doing my own work, I prefer to work on paper with a nib and ink and everything. It's slower and more frustrating in some ways, but the imperfections of those mediums sort of allow me to give up my control freak tendencies a little. I feel like a lot of cartoonists are just freaks by default because
Really?
we're trying to control every aspect of the page.
Huh.
But yeah, I then I scan everything into the computer and clean things up and color them digitally if I'm using color.
Yeah. What would you say is one of your favorite projects? Like what are you most proud of?
That's a good question. It was very exciting to get a recurring comic strip in Mad Magazine. That was sort of a childhood dream because I was raised on a lot of Mad Magazine. So being able to do that, especially when the magazine was still being published and was still coming out of New York, and a lot of the old guard people were still working on it, that was a really special time in my life. But in terms of my personal work, I did a story about 10 years ago called Buzzy that was sort of loosely based on a kid that I knew in elementary school who was bullied a lot and was simultaneously someone who was pretty unpleasant to be around. And so doing a grounded story, I tend towards too much magical realism in a lot of my work. So to do a grounded story where there were no sort of surreal or fantastical elements and some heavier subject matter than I usually do was a really interesting creative challenge. And sort of walking the line between the tensions of that story was very creatively satisfying to me.
Lovely. It's so good to have all three of you in studio, but we have a few more people to invite on the show. Riley Rossmo is one of them, another artist who's really making a name for himself. I didn't ask you, Jody, about him because I knew he was coming on the show. So let's learn all about Riley Rossmo from him. He moved to Saskatoon from Calgary a couple of years ago. And over the last 15 years, he's worked on a bunch of books and DC comics, including Harley Quinn and a Sandman miniseries. He has a new work, The Moon is Following Us, that's coming out in September. He's been listening, and now he joins us on the line. Riley, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. Tell us a bit of your story. How did you get into the world of comics?
I'm a lifelong addict, fan, consumer. Uh, they're like my thing, you know. They've always been my thing. When I was 5 years old, I got the first comic I can remember, and my grandma got it for me when I was super sick, and it was life changer. And I just can't get rid of them. I'm just in love with them. I'm just deeply in love with comics. Everything that everybody was saying is just like resonates with me, and all those titles. I'm a fan of all humor magazines. I'm a fan of YA stuff, superhero stuff, horror stuff, all of it. And I went to college for illustration in Calgary. That's why I moved there for a while.
Yeah.
And I was still deeply into comics, but at the art college at the time, they were kind of still is like a lowbrow thing. They weren't super accepted the way they are now. And it was before some of the really big books came out, or not big, but big in adaptation. The first one I remember, because I was working at the comic store, was 300, and we couldn't keep it on the shelf. Like the Frank Miller's 300, people were just handing them out as people came in through the door. And the same with Sin City. Anyways, I didn't think I'd be able to make comics for a living, because I draw sort of non-traditionally, and at the art college they're like, no, book publishing, that's it. Book covers, that's where you're going to make your money. Get into book covers and editorial. So I did.
Mm-hmm.
I did a bunch of advertising and stuff for the Herald and music, lots of music illustration for album covers and stuff and storyboards. But I just was making comics for myself for a long time. And so I was still in love with comics, but I didn't think I'd be able to do it. And then I just couldn't stop doing it.
Yeah.
And so I just kept doing it, and then just kept doing it and doing it and doing it.
I want to pick up on something you said there about it being kind of lowbrow. And I think there's been a real shift. There was a time when it wasn't really considered reading, and that's I like to think, no longer the case, right? But I'm wondering if you can speak to that a bit, right? Just sort of how long it's taken comic books to kind of come into their own, or for the public to see them differently. Yeah, wondering if you can
Well,
speak to that, Riley.
so when I went to Governor Park, École Governor Park in Saskatoon, and so I got this GI Joe comic from my grandma, and I was like, oh, I love comics. And so, I took French immersion, and there was only boring books. I felt like all the French books were super boring, except they had Tintin and Asterix. So I learned French comics and English comics, and they just kept coming into my life. And the teachers would, get us to read these really wonderful, like literary important books in French, and I just couldn't be bothered.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for a time it was like, some of my teachers and even my mom was concerned that, this isn't like reading. This is not prose reading. This isn't the thing. But it was like a gateway. And since then, I think comics are more accepted as like, a legitimate art form, or, a form of literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you guys talked about it already, but it's kind of interesting that like in the 40s, comics were sort of for kids and maybe not the most educated people. And then into the 50s, if I've got this right, they got really raw. Like EC comics were real violent and crime oriented and science fiction oriented. And then they got sort of sanitized, or maybe they got sanitized at the end of the 50s. Anybody jump in if they have a better idea about this?
Everybody's nodding, so you're totally like with
so
the right
like,
people here.
Like sort of like kids, lowbrow, adult, and then collapsed down into just for kids. You couldn't have red blood in comics. Like there's all these weird rules, and then it's like open back up now to everything.
So
like
interesting.
From literary comics to like mega violent horror comics or mega scary horror comics, and then to like with kids, the YA genre is huge. Like Babysitter's Club, the person who did Raina Telgemeier did the first few Babysitters Clubs, I believe, and she does these other books, and my daughter's crazy about them.
Yeah.
Like on our trip, she read 3 books in the car, like cover to cover. And she read prose too, but it's awesome. It's like Scholastic, so many comics in it when they get the little order forms, and it's great.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Don't go anywhere, Riley. And I want to put that same question to our guests in studio. I want to ask you.
Yeah.
Are you a fan of comic books?
Yeah, I've read comics on and off over the years. Yeah, I'd say I
Do you have a
like
favorite?
them. I mean, I think my favorite's probably American Splendor, which is pretty old now. I know Harvey Pekar died about 10 years ago, but he was
You're
pretty
getting
good.
2 thumbs up. You're getting 2 thumbs up.
There you
from
go.
our guests.
There you go.
Good choice, I guess.
I'm with it. You don't know what we're talking about.
I have no idea.
That's okay.
I don't know.
There was a
just brought up
movie
Ducks
with Paul
by Kate
Giamatti.
Newton, so.
Did you see the movie?
No, David.
Okay, well,
you know
never
your
mind.
audience here. Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know.
you're
You
in good
might
company.
have.
It's just not me. It's like
It's
everybody
a good,
else here.
Okay, watch the movie. The movie's good. And I want to put out a plug to A Miserable Guide in Saskatoon.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
He's at the Jazz Festival right now selling
Oh,
copies
really?
of Copy 1 or Edition 1 and Edition 2. Yeah.
My kids are 10 and 13, and my 10-year-old, quotes from A Miserable Guide to Saskatoon all the time. Even though he doesn't necessarily get all of the jokes, he still thinks they're funny. So, there you go.
It's so good. I buy that for people who are from Saskatoon and who have left. Awesome. David, thank you.
You're welcome.
That is the CBC's David Shield. I'm Lisa Gravinsky. You're listening to Blue Sky. Today we're talking about comic books, graphic novels. If you want to share with us a favorite, give us a shout, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. I was getting so many nods from our guests as Riley was talking. Dakota, I just want to give you a chance to add to what Riley said about comics being seen as lowbrow. Does that resonate with you? Did you have that sort of experience when you were growing up and wanting to read comic books?
Yes and no. My dad was really into comic books and had a bunch of old Mad magazines, and so he was sort of my gateway into that world. And we actually had a family friend who had a bookstore, and at the time when you didn't sell comics, they would rip the covers off and send them back to the publisher. So we would get these boxes of perfectly readable comics with no covers, and that was how I spent a lot of my summer days, was flipping through these dusty old boxes. So I was certainly aware of the lowbrow origins of comics. I should say that that's mostly been true in North America and countries like France and various countries in Europe and Japan. Comics have long been seen as a legitimate art form akin to literature,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's a very different history there. But like I did an undergraduate degree at the U of R in the fine arts program, and there was initially some of the professors pushed back on my interest in comics a little bit and saw that as separate from the arts, or
Mm-hmm.
that it was more too commercial to be real art, or whatever the arguments were. But I did have one professor, David Garneau, who really understood comics and cared about comics and sort of pushed me towards comic books that were more akin to literature. Work by Art Spiegelman, for example, who really elevated the comics medium in the 1980s with Raw magazine, where they were just being incredibly experimental and doing things that a lot of people hadn't done in comics before.
Yeah. This is such a great conversation. Patricia sent us a note. Patricia writes, my favorite comic creator is Charlene Clark from Moose Jaw, who has 3 graphic novels published, Lemons, very artistic designs, and great stories. Artistic, creative genius. Well, I think we have Charlene on the line, so let's say hello to Charlene Clark. Welcome to Blue Sky, Charlene.
Hi, thanks for having me on here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. You've been a visual artist for the past 20 years. Only recently, though, you've turned your attention to comics. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I made a bit of a creative pivot into writing. I wanted to continue illustrating as well. I started writing short horror stories. One of them was originally Lemons. I started building on it more and more and more, and then decided that was going to be my first graphic novel.
And where do you get your inspiration from?
I get it from all types of horror media. So mostly horror movies and horror comic books.
What do you think you're able to do with comics that you couldn't do with traditional art?
Um, I guess just tell a story with the words and with images. Um, it works really well with horror comics for my style to be able to try to get a very illustrative, gory, macabre kind of image across.
How have you found Saskatchewan's comic book scene? Just getting these wonderful descriptions from our guest today, like Jody, talking about that sense of community. How have you found the scene here?
I found it's been really great so far. I'm pretty new to the scene. I had my first convention in 2023 with my debut first issue of Lemons. So I'm pretty new. I don't have a lot to say about it. I think Jody pretty much summed it up really
Said it
well.
all. She's
Yeah.
smiling and saying, "Yeah." And how is your stuff received, Charlene? I'm just curious about the public reaction to it.
It's been received very well. I didn't really have like much expectations with it being my first comic book. Horror is a little bit of a niche genre as well. And Saskatchewan's kind of small, just and very widespread. But yeah, it's
Oh, did we just lose the call? Are you still there, Charlene?
yes, I am.
Oh, you are. Okay. Keep going.
So Moose Jaw's pretty small. It's where I'm closest to. I'm in Baildon. And then I'm also close to Regina. And I made it to Saskatoon a few times. And yeah, I've been really, really happy with how people have received this really dark, gory horror comic of mine.
Yeah. Is it a hard industry to break into? And there is something on my mind that I'd like to ask you each about, especially the 2 people who are in studio with me. Asking Dakota and Riley about just perceptions of comic books and whether or not it's reading and and the validity of the artwork. And we've kind of tackled that. But is there anything about gender that is worth talking about? Just wondering, as a woman, as a comic book artist doing gory stuff, is that a topic at all? I'll ask you that question, Charlene, and maybe there's nothing to talk about, but it is something I'm curious about.
Again, being like quite new to the industry, I don't have a whole lot of experience but I would say um, there's no surprise. It's if there is, it's like an excited surprise that I'm getting from people that I'm a female creating horror comics. I would say that I haven't read very many horror written, illustrated comic books done by females. So, yeah, I think people are very receptive to that right
Hmm.
now. They've been kind of waiting for it.
Yeah. Elaine, do you have anything to add to that? Is there anything about gender that's worth talking about in the comic book scene?
Yeah, I guess like there have been times where, I know that I've come up against some resistance because I'm a woman and nobody ever really like says it outright, but you can tell.
Hmm.
And but also I think that's changing, and my work has been pretty well received and taken seriously for the most part. Yeah.
Jody, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, certainly when in my teens and 20s, when I would go into stores, like, the boys who worked there would like scatter like cockroaches and nobody wanted to engage with me at all. And it was not a friendly environment at all. But over the last like 30 years, that has completely changed.
Yeah.
Like stores are diverse. They have diverse staff. Everybody is welcome. It's more family oriented. You see like kids, adults, women, men, everybody is there. So there's been a huge change in the last 30 years, I think.
Yeah.
And because there are so many more creators and there's more ways for people to get into comics. Like you don't have to get a contract with DC. There aren't that many of them.
Mm-hmm.
People are publishing on their own. They're creating on their own. They're doing web coms. They're doing stuff where they don't have to print, so the cost isn't as heavy. So there's so many more different ways for people to be engaged in comics. So those doors aren't as closed as they used to be because you can just decide to do it for yourself and open them on your own.
Riley, how have you seen the industry change? And you did say you have a daughter, right? Reading the graphic version of Babysitter Club, so that probably has opened your eyes to different things, but just curious what your thoughts are on how the industry has changed.
Well, I worked in a comic store in 2004, I think, when I finished art college, and just the variety of books being published and creators and stuff, even in that short a period of time, is really changed. And the sort of like gone are the days of the sort of Simpsons style um, comic book shops for the most part. I mean, they still exist, but I think in general they feel like used to lots of comic shops used to go in and you just feel like this sort of like presence around you, like sort of like I don't know. It's interesting that like now they're more like bookstores and they're open. Like I always think if I recommend a comic shop, if my mom would be comfortable there, and
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, this is a good comic shop because my mom can walk in and I think she'll feel good there.
Yeah,
She will
I
feel,
think I may be like your
you know,
mom. Like, would I feel comfortable there? Because even when you say Simpson style, I'm like, what do you mean by that? Like, what does that mean?
well, like Comic Guy and Simpsons. That is just sort of like a clubhouse for for
Yeah,
boys
I
or
know what
whatever.
you mean.
It's like that clubhouse sort of thing that is, you know,
Yeah. Okay.
we move past that, and I think that some of that too is that bookstores have really big comic book sections as well. So there's the two things sort of I feel like have fed into each other in changing that sort of barrier, like the physical barrier of going into a comic store. Because like I said, my mom being the sort of measuring stick for me if whether she's like goes into it or not. Because she'll tell me if she asks me about a comic store somewhere, and I'd be like, well, I don't know if you would like this one. And then she'll go by and be like, no, not for me.
Interesting. Oh, I find that
Yeah.
quite fascinating, actually. Dakota, anything there that you want to pick up on? Just how the industry has changed? Is it more inclusive, or especially now you got kids too? So how has that shifted your thinking on the scene?
Yeah, I think it's shifted in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, there's not only better comics being made for adults now, there's better comics being made for kids than ever, too, because they're being made by people who really care about the medium and are telling some really excellent stories with really excellent art. And it's not just a gig that you do. And I don't know. I mean, that shift happened for a lot of different reasons. For young people, I think it was the sort of increasing importation of manga. Japanese comics
Mm-hmm.
brought a lot of young readers in, especially young girls who typically at the time weren't necessarily reading a lot of comics. And so to have more access to comics from all over the world sort of expanded everyone's collective minds about what the medium can be and what it can do, which is pretty limitless, actually. It's possible to find comic books about just about anything, fact or fiction, and it's a really exciting time to be making and reading comics.
Yeah. And actually, one of my colleagues points out that Scholastic has so many LGBTQ plus options available through the school book fairs. And it actually just made me think of a graphic novel I read not long ago that was it a Netflix series first? Heartstopper? You guys familiar?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I read that and I loved it.
It's very good.
That is a wonderful series. Yeah. Okay. Charlene, I've got one more question for you before we say goodbye to you. When can people expect the next Lemons issue, Charlene?
Lemons issue 4 will be released near the end of August, beginning of September. I am aiming for end of August. I will be a guest at Gambate in Saskatoon, so it'd be great to have it for then. If not by then, I will have it for the Regina Expo, where I will also be a guest creator, and that's at the end of September.
Ooh, as a guest creator, so you're making art right there and people get to watch you in action?
Yeah.
Very cool. Charlene, so good to meet you today. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's Charlene Clark, an artist from Moose Jaw. Her comic Lemons is out now, and you heard another forthcoming one shortly. We've got 4 people on the show today. Jody Kaysen, Elaine Will, Dakota McFadden, and also Riley Rossmo. But before we talk more with them, let's go to one of our callers who joins us right now. That number to dial is 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca if you want to talk about comic books, graphic novels. Let's say hello to Joe in Saskatoon. Hi, Joe.
How you doing?
I'm well, thanks. You got a favorite comic book?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I was kind of wondering about back in the day, I used to watch this comic book was Captain Canuck. And I was a kid back then, and he's like a Canadian superhero and stuff like that. Haven't seen one of those forever. It's a good comic book. But what I appreciate is the fact for social issues is that they got this publication for youth now about no drugs, etc., and pregnancy and things like that. That's I like that comic book form, but still good. So I just kind of wonder if there's any place I can probably find that comic book because I like that. That was a good thing.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask Jody. Joe, thanks for calling.
Yes,
thank you.
Captain Canuck is still being made, and actually the creator, and his name is failing me, so forgive me, but he was through Saskatoon 2 years ago with his wife, and they did a cross-country tour and signed a bunch of books for us and stuff, and lovely person.
What kind of questions do you get at the store? Are people looking for, special finds? Or...
All kinds of stuff. Like, I found this box in my grandma's attic, and we don't know if it's worth anything. And, condition is critical when it comes to collectibles, of course. But, sometimes it's just like, well, it's an awesome story. That's the value. Like, keep those and share them with your family and your kids and your grandkids. Yeah. And then every once in a while, you might find a key issue. It's like, yeah, don't touch that. Put gloves on. Put it in a special bag. Like, if you want to sell it, here's what it's worth, but otherwise, keep that. It's special. So, yeah, we get all kinds of questions for sure.
Okay. Riley, I want to ask you about the independent comic scene and just how, what that's like. And in this, just how would you describe the independent comic scene right now?
Sure. Can I just jump in about what you asked Jody about?
Sure. That? Yeah, go ahead.
What Dakota was saying about books about everything is when I worked at the store, this guy came in one day and he said, do you have any books pertaining to shamanism? I was like, I do. That was awesome. There is a comic about everything. I had 3 or 4 different books about shamanism, and it was like, it made me so
hilarious.
Happy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Love that.
So, in terms of the breakdown between work for hire stuff.
Yeah. And just, even I think, was it you, Jody, that said there's just so many avenues now for people to create comics. So I'm just curious about, for people who are starting out and sure, maybe everybody wants to work for DC Comics or Marvel, but, the independent scene, what is that like now for people?
It's the best it's ever been because there is so many avenues, whether you want to print on demand self-publishing or web comics through a web comic publisher like Webtoons or something. publishing isn't so, physically dependent as it was, like that you had to be in New York, or I mean, basically you had to be in New York.
Hmm.
There's just so many more options, and there's a lot of there's like Marvel and DC and Dark Horse and some of the other companies that hire people to draw their characters. But there's some like in between sort of avenues now where the publishers they want a little bit of the intellectual property, but then they help you produce it too.
Oh,
it's not just like as cut and dry as that you own it or they own it. There's sort of like there's just a ton of options now that was not before.
How is technology changing things? Is there a threat to the comic book industry? I want to ask all of you, because something we talk a lot about in radio and media is artificial intelligence and just sort of what might be coming. So what are you guys talking about when it comes to AI? Riley, I'll start with you.
It depends creator to creator. We talk about it often, like amongst peers, like the sky is falling. Can it keep up? Does it look as good? I don't know. I think that people value the artifact and the art object. So to me, I like to think that moving forward, there will always be a place for the sort of like the art object, like vinyl. Like vinyl is a thing that people want. Is not the most convenient. If you don't have a great system, it doesn't sound the best. But the tactile experience is special. Yeah. I think it's special anyways.
I think so too.
And you can read a comic. Like I think Jody would agree with me. Like you can read a comic on an iPad, but it's not the same as. Like we've talked about, it's not the same as a book in your lap.
No, it's not the same.
I mean, it has pros. Like I like the idea, like you can read it there, and then you don't have to store it. Mm-hmm. It's like somebody has a kind of a big and out of control collection. Mm-hmm. So that's great. You can read things that you don't necessarily have to own. But there's nothing like taking your time and looking in the feel of the paper and the quality of the ink and all of those things come into play. Like for me, I'm old school and I really just like to have the book in hand. I don't like to scroll on a screen or on an iPad or anything like that, but it does have its place. And as an economical way to read a lot of comics, it's awesome. Like if you want to subscribe to like Marvel's thing, you can read all their stuff and it's like, it's a quick and easy way to do that. But there's libraries too. If budget is a concern, I always like to put in a plug for the library because as much as, yes, it is, I work at a comic book store, there's lots of stuff that's out of print that we can't get anymore. The library has it. If you have a kid who is just devouring books and you have no budget for that, the library is the most awesome resource. Go see your library. And we are really blessed in Saskatchewan in that our librarians have made a concerted effort to keep up on good graphic novels. Yeah. So like there's a good collection that you can pull from all over the province. It's an awesome way to get books.
Yeah. We're running out of time. This always happens to me close to 1 o'clock where I realize I have to start to wrap things up. But I'm very curious, Dakota, for your thoughts on artificial intelligence and whether or not it's a threat to your industry.
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning of the comics industry, there's been a tradition of publishers avoiding paying artists by any means necessary. So I don't doubt that there are publishers out there who would prefer to type something into a computer and have it spit out images. Whether or not that's viable to replace all cartoonists, I don't know. There's a pessimist in me that thinks the cat's out of the bag and we can't put it back in. And then there's a more optimistic side of me that thinks it'll be sort of absorbed like any other tool. I think there's always going to be humans who want to make work, and I would like to think that there's always going to be humans who would like to read work made by other humans. But I don't know. I mean, technology always has that other side too, where because art and media are so widely available now, there's sort of a devaluing that happens to it as well. It becomes something very disposable. People don't necessarily want to pay artists or pay, look at the music industry and how streaming has affected it. So it's certainly a concern for me as like a largely indie cartoonist. Most of the income I've made has not come from comics. It's come from doing illustration jobs or from storyboarding. And, that's the comics industry always feels like it's just on the edge of crisis in some ways in terms of getting artists paid. So I don't know what's going to happen. We will see where the technology takes us.
Yeah, fair enough. Elaine, what are you thinking about as you listen to this conversation? What are your thoughts on AI?
Yeah, so I'm also not sure where it's going. I do think that the AI bubble will probably burst soon because increasingly people are discovering it can't do any of the things that they say it can do, and we're not sure it ever will be able to be honest. And in terms of making comics, it doesn't seem to be very good at that because it can't do different camera angles, and it also can't render a consistent character unless you tell it to make a comic starring this celebrity, because there are lots of images of that celebrity out there. Like there was some terrible AI generated comic with Zendaya in it, for example. So again, I don't know, but it feels like my job is safe for now.
Yeah. Okay, well, fingers crossed.
Yes.
And, yes, I mean, you want to make an income, but obviously AI is not going to change your love of the craft, right? Like you will always draw, right?
Of course, yeah.
So that's a huge part of it. Okay, well, I think we have 1 minute. Do you want to give a recommendation? I mean, you could think about me, what could I read this summer? I've kind of told you a bit about me, but maybe you also want to give a recommendation to someone who's a bit more hardcore. But do each of you want to just give a recommendation to listeners of a comic book or a graphic novel they could read? Is it okay to put you on the spot? Who's got one at their fingertips? Dakota, you got one?
Yeah. So I kind of fell out of comics during the pandemic, and I read a book called Tender by Beth Hetland, which just came out. It's a deep, dark horror comic. It's certainly not for everyone, but it's one of the best comic books I've ever read, and it sort of made me fall in love with the medium again. So strongly recommended. Tender.
Okay. Riley, you got one?
I would say for the art lover, Wednesday Comics, if it's still in print. It's this giant, oversized DC comic that they put out initially as big newspaper-sized comics.
Oh, cool.
It's awesome. It's huge.
Very
It's
cool.
19 by 12 inches or something.
Okay. Jody, do you got one?
Yeah, Barry Windsor Smith, Monsters. He's kind of known for Conan and Tarzan and stuff, but his black and white artwork is stunning, and it's this vast story with all these different people, and it's horror and crime, and it will make the best TV show. So, if you want something that just will wrap your arms around it, it's great. It might take you all summer to read it to really appreciate every panel, though, but it's beautiful.
Elaine, what about you?
I don't know where to start. There are so many. So I guess I will also recommend a horror book. So Dwellings by Jay Stevens, who is Canadian. And so it is also, it's like a brutal horror comic, but it's drawn in the style of Harvey comics.
Oh my gosh.
Casper the Friendly Ghost, which was mentioned by Dakota earlier.
That's hilarious. Okay, well, this has been really fun. You've given us some books to read over the summer, and I've had a wonderful time having this conversation with all of you. So thanks. I've got a lot of people to thank. So Jody, thank you.
You're welcome.
Elaine, thank you. Dakota, thank you.
Thank
and
you.
Riley, thanks so much. Take care, you guys.
Thanks.
That was Jody Kazin, who works at Amazing Stories, does Punch Radio and television. Elaine Will was one of our guests today, and she's been making comics since she was 5. Dakota McFadden, and also Riley Rossmo. I am Leisha Grabinski. You've been listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1.